Sarah Mitchell had always been fascinated by the traditions and pageantry of royal ceremonies. As a history teacher from a small town in Ohio, she had saved for 3 years to make her dream trip to London. The 45-year-old mother of 2 had always told her students about the dedication of the Queen's Guard, but she had never imagined she would witness something that would change her understanding of duty, compassion, and human connection. It was a crisp autumn morning in October when Sarah joined the crowd of tourists gathering outside Buckingham Palace. The leaves were turning golden, and there was an excitement in the air as hundreds of people from around the world waited to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. Sarah had arrived early, hoping to get a good spot to take photographs for her classroom back home. As she positioned herself near the palace gates, she noticed a young guard standing perfectly still at his post. His red uniform was immaculate, his black bearskin hat precisely positioned and his rifle held at the perfect angle. But what struck Sarah most was his face. Despite the stoic expression required of his position, she could see something in his eyes that reminded her of her own son, who was serving in the military overseas. The guard couldn't have been more than 22 years old, Sarah thought. His name tag read Private Thompson, and despite the formal requirements of his role, there was something about his demeanor that seemed different from the other guards she had observed. While maintaining his military bearing, there was a subtle warmth in his expression that caught her attention. Around her, tourists were taking selfies, children were pointing and asking questions, and the usual chatter of a crowd filled the air. Sarah watched as Private Thompson remained motionless, his training evident in every aspect of his posture. She had read about how these guards underwent months of rigorous training, learning to stand still for hours regardless of weather conditions or distractions from tourists. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed something that made her heart ache. An elderly man in a wheelchair was struggling to get a good view of the ceremony. His granddaughter, probably about 8 years old, was trying to help him maneuver through the crowd, but people kept blocking their path. The little girl looked frustrated and disappointed, and the grandfather seemed embarrassed by the difficulty they were having. Without hesitation, Sarah approached them. "Excuse me," she said gently to the grandfather. "Would you like to move up front? I think I can help you get a better spot." The elderly man, whose name was Albert, gratefully accepted her offer. Together they carefully navigated through the crowd until they reached a position where Albert would have an unobstructed view of the ceremony. As they settled into their new spot, Sarah learned that Albert was a World War II veteran who had always wanted to bring his granddaughter Lucy to see the Queen's Guard. This was likely to be his last trip to London, as his health had been declining. Lucy held his hand tightly, her eyes wide with wonder, as she took in the spectacle before them. The ceremony began with the familiar sounds of military precision. The guards marched in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. Sarah watched in awe, but her attention kept returning to Private Thompson, who remained at his stationary post. There was something about his presence that commanded respect, yet seemed approachable in a way that surprised her. As the ceremony continued, Sarah noticed that Lucy had dropped her small stuffed bear, a well-worn toy that was clearly her comfort object. The bear had fallen just out of reach near the feet of Private Thompson. Lucy looked distressed, tugging on her grandfather's sleeve and pointing toward the lost toy. Albert tried to reach for it, but his wheelchair made it impossible. The crowd was thick, and nobody seemed to notice the little girl's predicament. Sarah saw the tears beginning to form in Lucy's eyes and felt her heart break. She looked toward Private Thompson, knowing that he was bound by strict protocol not to move or acknowledge the crowd during his duty. Yet, she could see that he had noticed the situation too. What happened next would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. Without breaking his formal stance or compromising his duties, Private Thompson made the slightest movement with his foot, gently nudging the stuffed bear closer to where Albert could reach it. The movement was so subtle that most people in the crowd didn't even notice, but it was enough. Albert was able to retrieve the bear and hand it back to Lucy, whose face immediately lit up with joy. She clutched the toy tightly and looked up at Private Thompson with the kind of pure admiration that only a child can express. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she witnessed this small act of kindness that demonstrated how humanity could shine through even the most rigid of protocols. The moment was brief, but it spoke volumes about the character of the young guard. Sarah realized that beneath the formal uniform and ceremonial duties was a person who understood that sometimes the smallest gestures could mean the world to someone else. Private Thompson had managed to help without compromising his position or breaking the rules, showing a level of creativity and compassion that impressed her deeply. As the ceremony drew near its conclusion, Sarah found herself thinking about her own son and wondering if he possessed the same kind of quiet strength and compassion that she had just witnessed. The guard's simple act of kindness had reminded her that military service wasn't just about following orders and maintaining discipline, but also about protecting and caring for others, even in the smallest ways. The crowd began to disperse, but Sarah remained in her spot, still processing what she had experienced. She looked at Albert, who was beaming with pride at having shared this moment with his granddaughter, and at Lucy, who was now waving enthusiastically at Private Thompson. The guard, while maintaining his professional demeanor, seemed to have a slight twinkle in his eye that suggested he was pleased to have been able to help. Sarah knew that this experience had already exceeded her expectations for the trip, but she had no idea that what was about to happen next would create a memory that would touch the hearts of people around the world. As the crowd began to thin out after the ceremony, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave. There was something about the atmosphere and the connection she had witnessed that made her want to linger. She watched as families took their final photographs and tourists started making their way toward other London attractions. Albert and Lucy had also prepared to leave, but not before Albert wheeled his chair closer to where Private Thompson was stationed. "Thank you, young man," Albert called out quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. "You made an old soldier and his granddaughter very happy today." Lucy waved her stuffed bear enthusiastically, and though Private Thompson couldn't respond verbally or move from his position, Sarah could see the subtle acknowledgement in his eyes. As Albert and Lucy departed, Sarah noticed a shift in the dynamics around Private Thompson's post. Word of his small kindness had spread among the remaining tourists, and people began to look at him with a new level of respect and interest. Several visitors had witnessed the incident with the stuffed bear, and some had even managed to capture it on their phones. Sarah approached Private Thompson's position slowly, not wanting to interfere with his duties, but feeling compelled to express her appreciation for what she had witnessed. She stood quietly for a moment, observing the discipline and dedication required to maintain such a position. The guard's commitment to his role was evident in every aspect of his bearing, from his perfectly polished boots to the precise angle of his rifle. The morning sun had grown stronger, and Sarah could see beads of perspiration forming on Private Thompson's forehead. Standing motionless for hours in heavy ceremonial uniform must have been physically demanding, yet he showed no signs of discomfort or fatigue. His breathing was steady, his posture unwavering, and his focus remained complete. Other tourists continued to pass by, some taking pictures, others simply admiring the spectacle of the Queen's Guard. Children pointed and whispered, adults explained the traditions to their families, and everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special. The Guards represented centuries of British military tradition, and their presence connected the modern world to a rich historical legacy. As Sarah continued to observe, she reflected on the training and dedication required to become one of the Queen's Guard. She knew that these young men and women underwent months of intensive preparation, learning not only the military skills required for their ceremonial duties, but also developing the mental fortitude necessary to maintain their composure under any circumstances. The selection process for the Queen's Guard was notoriously difficult. Candidates had to demonstrate exceptional physical fitness, mental resilience, and unwavering commitment to duty. They learned to stand perfectly still for extended periods, regardless of weather conditions, crowd behavior, or personal discomfort. The training was designed to prepare them for any situation they might encounter during their service. Sarah had read about instances where guards had fainted from heat exhaustion, been harassed by tourists, or faced various disruptions. Yet they were expected to maintain their composure at all times. The job required a unique combination of physical strength, mental discipline, and emotional control that few people could master. What struck Sarah most about Private Thompson was how he had managed to show compassion while adhering to his strict protocols. The movement of his foot to help Lucy retrieve her bear had been so subtle that it didn't compromise his duties, yet it was significant enough to make a real difference to a distressed child. This balance between duty and humanity impressed her deeply. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed that Private Thompson's shift was nearing its end. She had learned from other tourists that the guards typically rotated every few hours, and the formal ceremony for changing positions was as precise and dignified as everything else about their service. She found herself curious about what would happen when his duty period concluded. The changing of the guard at individual posts was less ceremonious than the morning's main event, but no less impressive in its precision. Sarah watched as another guard approached to relieve Private Thompson, and the formal transfer of responsibility took place with military efficiency. Every movement was calculated, every gesture had meaning, and the transition occurred seamlessly. As Private Thompson was officially relieved of his post, Sarah expected him to march away immediately, following the standard protocol for departing guards. Instead, something unexpected happened that would turn this already memorable day into something extraordinary. Rather than leaving directly, Private Thompson paused and looked toward the crowd of remaining tourists. His eyes found Sarah, who had been watching the entire proceedings with deep interest and respect. For a moment, their gazes met, and Sarah saw something in his expression that she hadn't expected. There was a recognition there, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed through their shared experience with Albert and Lucy. What Private Thompson did next surprised everyone present, including Sarah herself. Instead of maintaining the formal distance that protocol typically required, he began to walk toward her. His movements were still precise and military in bearing, but there was a purposefulness to his approach that suggested he had made a deliberate decision. Other tourists in the area began to notice this unusual behavior. Guards typically completed their duties and departed without interacting with the public beyond their ceremonial roles. The fact that Private Thompson was approaching a member of the crowd was highly unusual and drew the attention of everyone nearby. Sarah felt a mix of surprise, curiosity, and slight nervousness as the guard approached her. She wasn't sure what protocol demanded in such a situation, and she didn't want to do anything that might cause problems for him. Her mind raced with possibilities about what might be happening and what she should do in response. The crowd around them began to quiet down, sensing that something significant was occurring. Phones came out as people prepared to capture whatever was about to happen, though most weren't sure what to expect. The atmosphere became charged with anticipation as Private Thompson covered the final few steps toward where Sarah was standing. When he reached her, Private Thompson stopped and looked directly into her eyes. Sarah could see that he was young, probably close to her son's age, and that despite his formal training and military bearing, he was still fundamentally human. There was warmth in his expression, and she could sense that he was about to do something that came from his heart rather than from his training manual. The moment seemed to stretch in time as Private Thompson stood before Sarah, his military bearing intact but his eyes conveying something deeply personal. Sarah could feel the attention of the surrounding crowd, but her focus was entirely on the young guard who had approached her with such purposeful intent. "Ma'am," Private Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't quite place. "I wanted to thank you for what you did for the elderly gentleman and his granddaughter earlier. It meant a great deal to see such kindness from a visitor." Sarah was taken aback by his words. She had expected many possible explanations for his approach, but gratitude for her small act of helping Albert and Lucy had not been among them. "Oh, that was nothing," she replied softly, feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the unexpected interaction. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No, ma'am, not everyone would have," Private Thompson continued, his voice sincere and thoughtful. "I've stood at this post for many months, and I've seen thousands of tourists come and go. Most are kind and respectful, but few take the time to notice when someone needs help, and even fewer act on it." As they spoke, Sarah became aware that their conversation was drawing considerable attention. Other tourists had stopped to watch, phones were recording, and she could see security personnel in the distance observing the situation. She worried that Private Thompson might be breaking protocol and could face consequences for his actions. "I hope you won't get in trouble for talking to me," Sarah said with concern in her voice. "I wouldn't want my presence to cause any problems for you." Private Thompson smiled slightly, the first break in his formal expression that Sarah had seen. "I'm off duty now, ma'am. I have a few minutes before I need to report back, and I felt compelled to speak with you. What you did today reminded me why we serve, and I wanted you to know that it was noticed and appreciated." The sincerity in his voice touched Sarah deeply. She thought about her own son, deployed overseas, and wondered if he had encountered similar moments of kindness from strangers. The idea that her simple act of helping an elderly veteran and his granddaughter had resonated with this young guard filled her with unexpected emotion. "May I ask where you're from?" Sarah inquired, genuinely curious about the person behind the uniform. "I'm from a small village in Wales," Private Thompson replied. "My family has a tradition of military service. My grandfather served in the Royal Navy, my father in the Army, and now here I am, following in their footsteps. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace is considered a great honor, but sometimes it can feel isolating, especially when you witness humanity at its best and can't participate directly." Sarah began to understand why her actions had affected him so profoundly. As a guard, he was trained to observe and protect, but his role required him to remain detached from the human dramas playing out around him. Witnessing kindness while being unable to engage directly must have created a complex mix of emotions. "How long have you been serving as a Queen's Guard?" she asked, finding herself increasingly interested in his story. 8 months now," he answered. "The training was intense, and the responsibility is enormous, but there are moments like today that remind me why I chose this path. Seeing visitors, like yourself, show such respect for our traditions and such kindness to fellow tourists makes the long hours and difficult conditions worthwhile." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of another uniformed figure, a sergeant who seemed to be checking on the situation. Sarah tensed, worried that Private Thompson was about to face discipline for their interaction. However, the sergeant's expression was more curious than stern. "Thompson, is everything all right here?" the sergeant asked, his tone professional but not unkind. "Yes, Sergeant Davies," Private Thompson replied, returning to a more formal posture. "I was just thanking this visitor for her assistance to some tourists earlier today. She helped an elderly veteran and his granddaughter, and I felt it was important to acknowledge her kindness." Sergeant Davies looked at Sarah with interest. "Is that so? What happened, if you don't mind my asking?" Sarah felt embarrassed by the attention, but explained briefly about helping Albert and Lucy find a better viewing position and how Private Thompson had subtly helped Lucy retrieve her dropped toy. As she spoke, she could see that Sergeant Davies was impressed by both her actions and Private Thompson's discretion in helping, while maintaining his duties. "Well then," Sergeant Davies said after hearing the story, "it seems we have 2 examples of proper conduct to celebrate today. Thompson, you handled that situation with the child's toy very professionally, and ma'am, your kindness to our visitors reflects well on everyone present." The sergeant's approval seemed to ease any concerns about protocol violations, and Sarah felt relief that Private Thompson wouldn't face consequences for their conversation. She also sensed that something more significant was about to happen, as Sergeant Davies appeared to be considering the situation carefully. "Thompson," the sergeant continued, "you have a few more minutes before you need to report. Why don't you take a proper break and continue your conversation with this kind visitor? It's not often we have the opportunity to express our appreciation directly." With that, Sergeant Davies moved away, but not before giving Sarah a respectful nod that conveyed his own appreciation for her actions earlier in the day. Sarah found herself alone again with Private Thompson, but now with the explicit approval of his superior officer. "That was unexpected," Sarah said, feeling more relaxed now that the formal concerns had been addressed. "Sergeant Davies is a good man," Private Thompson replied. "He understands that our service is ultimately about people, and he appreciates when civilians show respect for what we do. Your kindness today demonstrated the kind of values we're trained to protect and serve." As they continued talking, Sarah learned more about Private Thompson's background and motivations. His name was actually David Thompson, and he had grown up in a farming community where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. The sense of duty and community service that had guided his upbringing had naturally led him to military service. "I have to admit," David said, "there are times when this job can feel quite isolating. We're surrounded by thousands of people every day, but we can't interact with them in normal ways. Today felt different, though. Seeing your kindness and being able to help that little girl, even in such a small way, reminded me that we're all connected." Sarah felt a deep resonance with his words. As a teacher, she understood the satisfaction that came from helping others, even in seemingly small ways. She also understood the challenges of maintaining professional boundaries while still caring deeply about the people around you. As Sarah and David continued their conversation, she found herself thinking about the parallels between their different forms of service. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I'm a teacher back home in Ohio, and I think there are similarities between what you do and what I do. We both serve the public, and we both have to maintain certain professional boundaries while still caring deeply about the people we encounter." David's eyes lit up with interest. "A teacher? That's wonderful. What grade do you teach?" "High school history," Sarah replied. "I actually tell my students about the Queen's Guard as part of our unit on British government and traditions. After today, I'll have much more personal stories to share with them." "That's incredible," David said with genuine enthusiasm. "It's fascinating to think that students in Ohio are learning about what we do here. What do you tell them about us?" Sarah smiled, pleased by his genuine interest. "I talk about the discipline, the history, the dedication to duty regardless of personal comfort or distraction. But I think after today, I'll also be able to talk about the humanity that exists within that framework. What you did for Lucy showed that being professional doesn't mean being heartless." Their conversation was drawing continued attention from passers-by, but it was clear that word of the morning's events had spread. Rather than seeming intrusive, the observers appeared respectful and interested. Some were clearly moved by witnessing such a genuine human connection in a setting typically associated with formal distance and ceremony. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah ventured. "Do you ever get lonely doing this job? It must be difficult to be surrounded by so many people but unable to interact normally with them." David considered the question carefully before answering. "It can be challenging," he admitted. "The isolation is part of the sacrifice we make in service. But days like today remind me that connection doesn't always require conversation. Sometimes just being present, being reliable, being there when people need you is enough." Sarah nodded, understanding the depth of his commitment. "My son is deployed overseas right now," she shared. "He's in the army, stationed in Germany. Talking with you today helps me feel more connected to what his daily experience might be like." The mention of Sarah's son seemed to resonate deeply with David. "What's his name, if you don't mind my asking?" "Michael," Sarah replied. "He's about your age, actually. This is his second deployment. He joined the army right after high school, said he wanted to serve his country and see the world. I worry about him, of course, but I'm also incredibly proud of his dedication." David's expression grew thoughtful. "Please give Michael my regards when you speak with him next. Military service can be challenging, especially when you're far from home, but knowing that people like you appreciate what we do makes all the difference in the world." As they talked, Sarah began to understand that their encounter was becoming something special for both of them. For David, it was a rare opportunity to connect personally with someone who understood and appreciated his service. For Sarah, it was a chance to gain insight into the mind and heart of someone who had chosen to dedicate his life to serving others. "Would it be appropriate for me to give you a hug?" Sarah asked suddenly, the words coming from her heart before her mind could analyze them. "I know you're still in uniform and there might be protocol issues, but I feel like I want to thank you properly for your kindness today and for helping me understand what service really means." David looked surprised by the request, and for a moment, Sarah worried that she had overstepped some important boundary. She was about to apologize and withdraw the suggestion when David smiled warmly. "I think that would be very nice," he said softly. "It's not every day that someone wants to thank a guard for doing his job. and after the morning we've shared, it feels like the right thing to do." Sarah stepped forward and embraced David gently. It was a brief hug, respectful and appropriate, but filled with genuine warmth and gratitude. As they embraced, Sarah felt the weight of his service, the dedication he brought to his role, and the basic human need for connection that existed beneath his professional exterior. The crowd around them had grown larger during their conversation, and as Sarah and David hugged, a spontaneous round of applause broke out among the observers. People were clearly moved by what they had witnessed, recognizing that they were seeing something authentic and meaningful in a world that often felt disconnected and impersonal. When they separated, both Sarah and David had tears in their eyes. The emotional impact of their encounter had surprised them both, and they stood there for a moment processing what had just occurred. "Thank you," David said quietly. "That meant more to me than you can possibly know. Sometimes we forget that what we do matters to people, and your kindness today has reminded me why I chose this path." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "You've given me something precious to take home with me. I'll tell my students about meeting you, and I'll tell my son about the guard who showed me that duty, and compassion can coexist beautifully." As they stood there, both aware that their time together was drawing to a close, Sarah realized that she had experienced something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. What had begun as a tourist visit to see a famous ceremony had become a profound lesson about human connection, service, and the ways that small acts of kindness can create ripples of meaning that extend far beyond their immediate impact. David glanced at his watch and realized that he needed to report back soon. "I'm afraid I have to go now," he said with genuine regret. "But I want you to know that this conversation has been the highlight of my service so far." "For me too," Sarah replied. "Thank you for taking the time to talk with me, and thank you for everything you do." As David prepared to leave, neither of them realized that their embrace and conversation had been captured on numerous phones and cameras. The images and videos would soon find their way to social media, where their story would touch the hearts of people around the world and become a symbol of the power of human kindness and connection. 3 months after Sarah's encounter with David Thompson, the story had taken on dimensions that neither of them could have imagined. What began as a simple act of kindness and a moment of genuine human connection had evolved into a global movement, celebrating service, compassion, and the power of treating others with dignity and respect. Sarah returned to her classroom in Ohio with a renewed sense of purpose. Her students were fascinated by her first-hand account of meeting one of the Queen's Guard, and the story became a central part of her curriculum on citizenship, service, and the importance of small acts of kindness. She created a project where students had to identify and perform their own acts of service in their community, documenting how these actions affected both themselves and others. Mrs. Mitchell's story shows us that being kind doesn't cost anything, but it can change everything, wrote one of her students in a reflection essay. "I never thought about how people in the military might feel when they're doing their jobs, but now I understand that they're people just like us, and they probably appreciate it when someone notices what they do." The story had also reached Michael, Sarah's son, in ways that surprised both of them. His commanding officers had heard about his mother's encounter, and Michael found himself somewhat famous among his fellow soldiers. More importantly, the story had inspired acts of kindness within his own unit, as soldiers began making extra efforts to connect with local communities and to support each other during difficult assignments. "Mom, you've become a celebrity here," Michael told Sarah during one of their weekly calls. "But more than that, your story has changed how we think about our interactions with civilians. We've started a program where we volunteer at local schools and community centers, helping people understand what military life is really like while also learning more about the communities where we're stationed." Meanwhile, David Thompson's life had also been transformed by the experience. The positive attention generated by their encounter had led to new opportunities within his military career. He was selected to participate in public relations activities for the Queen's Guard, helping to bridge the gap between the formal ceremonial duties and the public's desire to understand the people behind the uniforms. David was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and military recruitment events, sharing his perspective on service and the importance of maintaining humanity within professional duty. He discovered that he had a talent for public speaking and a genuine passion for helping others understand the values that drove military service. That day with Sarah changed my understanding of what it means to serve, David would tell audiences. I learned that our duty isn't just about following protocol or maintaining traditions. It's about representing. 3 months after Sarah's encounter with David Thompson, the story had taken on dimensions that neither of them could have imagined. What began as a simple act of kindness and a moment of genuine human connection had evolved into a global movement, celebrating service, compassion, and the power of treating others with dignity and respect. Sarah returned to her classroom in Ohio with a renewed sense of purpose. Her students were fascinated by her first-hand account of meeting one of the Queen's Guard, and the story became a central part of her curriculum on citizenship, service, and the importance of small acts of kindness. She created a project where students had to identify and perform their own acts of service in their community, documenting how these actions affected both themselves and others. Mrs. Mitchell's story shows us that being kind doesn't cost anything, but it can change everything, wrote one of her students in a reflection essay. I never thought about how people in the military might feel when they're doing their jobs, but now I understand that they're people just like us, and they probably appreciate it when someone notices what they do. The story had also reached Michael, Sarah's son, in ways that surprised both of them. His commanding officers had heard about his mother's encounter, and Michael found himself somewhat famous among his fellow soldiers. More importantly, the story had inspired acts of kindness within his own unit, as soldiers began making extra efforts to connect with local communities and to support each other during difficult assignments. Mom, you've become a celebrity here, Michael told Sarah during one of their weekly calls. But more than that, your story has changed how we think about our interactions with civilians. We've started a program where we volunteer at local schools and community centers, helping people understand what military life is really like, while also learning more about the communities where we're stationed. Meanwhile, David Thompson's life had also been transformed by the experience. The positive attention generated by their encounter had led to new opportunities within his military career. He was selected to participate in public relations activities for the Queen's Guard, helping to bridge the gap between the formal ceremonial duties and the public's desire to understand the people behind the uniforms. David was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and military recruitment events, sharing his perspective on service and the importance of maintaining humanity within professional duty. He discovered that he had a talent for public speaking and a genuine passion for helping others understand the values that drove military service. That day with Sarah changed my understanding of what it means to serve, David would tell audiences. I learned that our duty isn't just about following protocol or maintaining traditions. It's about representing the best of human values and showing others that strength and compassion can coexist beautifully. The ripple effects of their encounter continued to spread in unexpected ways. Albert, the World War II veteran whom Sarah had helped that day, had been deeply moved when he learned about the global attention their brief interaction had generated. Despite his declining health, he became an advocate for intergenerational connections between veterans and active military personnel. Albert worked with local veterans organizations to create programs that brought together older veterans like himself with young service members, fostering understanding and mutual support across different generations of military experience. That young American woman in that British Guard showed me that kindness creates connections that transcend borders and generations, Albert would say at these gatherings. Lucy, Albert's granddaughter, was now 9 years old and had become something of a local celebrity in her own right. Her dropped teddy bear and David's subtle assistance had captured hearts around the world, and she had received letters and gifts from children in dozens of countries. More significantly, Lucy had developed a deep interest in helping others, inspired by the kindness she had witnessed and been part of that memorable day. The story had also caught the attention of charitable organizations and military support groups. A foundation was established in honor of Sarah and David's encounter, dedicated to supporting military families and promoting acts of kindness in communities around the world. The foundation, called the Bridge Foundation, worked to connect civilians with military personnel in positive, meaningful ways. Sarah was invited to serve on the foundation's board of directors, a role she accepted with enthusiasm. "I never imagined that a simple vacation to London would lead to this," she said at the foundation's inaugural event. "But I've learned that when we open our hearts to others and act with kindness, we never know how far those actions might travel, or how many lives they might touch." The Foundation's first major initiative was creating kindness gardens in communities near military bases around the world. These spaces served as meeting places where military families and local civilians could interact in informal, positive settings. The gardens featured plaques telling Sarah and David's story, reminding visitors that small acts of kindness could have profound impacts. David was eventually promoted and given new responsibilities that allowed him to work more closely with community outreach programs. He never forgot the lesson he learned that day outside Buckingham Palace about the importance of human connection within professional duty. His superiors noted that he had an exceptional ability to maintain military discipline, while also demonstrating the kind of approachability that helped the public understand and appreciate military service. A year after their initial meeting, Sarah and David were reunited at a special ceremony hosted by the Bridge Foundation. The event brought together military personnel and civilians from around the world to celebrate the power of kindness and human connection. Sarah's son Michael was able to attend, having received leave specifically to participate in the celebration. When Sarah and David saw each other again, their embrace was just as warm and meaningful as it had been that first day, but now it carried the weight of everything that had grown from their initial encounter. They had become symbols of how genuine human connection could transcend the barriers that often separate people from different backgrounds and circumstances. "When I hugged you that day," Sarah told David during their reunion, "I was just following my heart. I had no idea we were planting seeds that would grow into something this beautiful and far-reaching." "The wonderful thing about kindness," David replied, "is that it doesn't require grand gestures or perfect planning. It just requires us to see each other as human beings and to act with compassion. You taught me that lesson, and now thousands of people around the world are learning it, too." The story of Sarah and David's encounter continued to inspire new acts of kindness years after their initial meeting. Their example showed that in a world often divided by differences in nationality, profession, age, and background, the simple act of treating others with dignity and respect could create connections that bridged any gap. Schools around the world began teaching their story as an example of global citizenship and the power of individual actions to create positive change. Military academies included it in their training programs as a demonstration of how professional duty and human compassion could work together rather than in opposition to each other. Most importantly, their story reminded people everywhere that they had the power to make a difference in the world through their daily choices and interactions, whether it was helping an elderly person find a better view of a ceremony, acknowledging someone's service with gratitude, or simply treating others with kindness and respect. Every person had the ability to create positive change. Sarah returned to her teaching with a deeper understanding of how individual actions could create lasting impact. David continued his military service with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his duty extended beyond following orders to include representing the best values of service and humanity. Together, they had created something beautiful that would continue inspiring others for generations to come. Their story became a testament to the truth that kindness is never wasted, compassion is always noticed, and the connections we make with others have the power to change not just our own lives, but the lives of countless people we may never meet. In a world that often seemed divided and disconnected, Sarah and David had shown that love, respect, and human dignity could still prevail when people chose to act with open hearts and genuine care for one another.